Hello everyone, I'm Deacon Christian, and I hope you all are doing really well and having a really wonderful summer so far. Today, as I begin this reflection for the 13th Sunday of Ordinary Time, I'd like to begin by asking a question. Have you ever had a moment in your life, or perhaps you've had many moments like this, where out of anger or frustration, disappointment, exhaustion, just in a moment of despair, ever turn to the Lord and just say, Lord, I cannot do this on my own. Lord, I need you. To be in despair, to have that feeling of you have nowhere else to turn but to turn to the Lord. Because each one of us has our own challenges and our own struggles, I think in some manner and in some form, each one of us have had a moment like this where we turn to the Lord in prayer, just in a moment of a feeling of desperation and saying, Lord, I need you. Lord, I can't do this on my own, and asking the Lord to show up in a really beautiful, miraculous way. This is really important to consider when we think about the gospel from today's Mass, from the Gospel of Mark. Because today we're given two separate accounts of healings. And it's a very unique literary characteristic of the Gospel of Mark when he's writing a story that he sandwiches one story inside of another story. And so today in the Gospel, it begins with Jairus coming to Jesus and saying, Lord, please come and heal my daughter. Please lay your hands on her because she is sick. And as Jesus goes with him to his house, he gets stopped by the woman who touches his cloak, the woman suffering with the hemorrhages. And there's a lot of unique correspondence between these two stories. The woman who has been suffering with bleeding from her hemorrhages for 12 years, the little girl that Jesus brings back to life, was 12 years old. The lady with the hemorrhages reaches out to Jesus to touch him, to touch his cloak, to be healed. She reaches out with her hand. And when Jesus goes to the little girl, he reaches out his hand and says, little girl, arise. And the woman with the hemorrhages who is slowly dying, she's slowly approaching death, anticipates the healing of the girl who actually does taste death. But both are situations of despair. And if we consider the woman with the hemorrhages, how utter desperate she was for an authentic healing from the Lord. Because she was chronically bleeding, according to the law of Moses, she was perpetually unclean. She would have been outcast from society. She couldn't be in contact with others because anything that she touched, anything that she sat upon, would also become unclean. And Mark magnifies her struggle by saying that for years she had spent all that she had, all of her money, on doctors. And her condition only got worse. Worst of all, being perpetually unclean, she would not be able to worship with God's people in the temple. She literally had nothing left to lose. And she comes to Jesus with such bold faith. She has this faith that even if she could just touch his cloak, she would be healed. And she comes behind Jesus, having heard about Jesus, thinking, I've got nothing else to lose. I am desperate. I need Jesus. She comes behind him and touches his cloak. And that is an incredibly bold move on behalf of this woman, because by doing so, she has broken the law of ritual purity, because anything that she touched was supposed to become unclean. The very same dynamic that happened with the leper, when Jesus heals the leper. And in both situations, although he has touched them, Jesus never becomes unclean. But what a beautiful act of faith that she comes forward to Jesus and says, I just want to touch his cloak. And Jesus, knowing that the power has gone from him, turns around, because he doesn't just want this woman to experience a physical healing. Because Jesus knows that complete healing, both physical and spiritual, can only come from an authentic encounter with him, from an authentic relationship with him. And so Jesus turns so that he may offer his loving gaze upon this woman and that he can enter into a relationship with her. And this woman becomes a model for how you and I approach Jesus. In the gospel story, we hear that, Jesus was in the crowds and people were bumping into him. And so when Jesus says, "Who touched me?" his disciples kind of mock him and say, "Lord, you're in a crowd with a bunch of people. How do you know who touched you?" But Jesus knows that someone has touched him in faith. And Jesus knows that her touch was different. Because while others would simply just kind of bump into him, she reached out in faith. And so this woman is a model for us, and she allows us to ask ourselves this question: how often do we just kind of bump into Jesus? And so, for example, and my question for all of us is, how often when we come to Mass, when we come to the Holy Altar, do we remember that we don't just touch the cloak of Jesus, that we receive him completely? His body, his blood, his soul, and divinity. We don't just touch his cloak, we receive him completely. That Jesus desires for us to be healed physically and spiritually, that he literally gives us himself. And yet, how often do we just kind of bump into Jesus? How often do we just kind of come to Mass with a distracted mind and a distracted heart? Or does Mass just become another checklist item? My brothers and sisters, today we are reminded to approach Jesus with a bold faith. To approach him boldly, not just in moments of despair, but always. To not become indifferent to our faith when life and things are easy and when things are good, but to turn to him always boldly and know that he wants to heal us. And he wants to heal us in a way that only he knows how. And in a timing that only he knows. And so let us be reminded, let us be encouraged, and let us ask for the grace to be amazed. To be amazed that every time we receive communion, we don't just bump into Jesus or we don't just touch his cloak, that we consume him completely. And he has given the very gift of himself to us so that we too may be healed. God bless you.